June 17, 1943, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Vogel stood in line with 200 other German prisoners waiting for his first meal in American captivity. He had been captured in Tunisia 3 weeks earlier, transported by ship across the Atlantic, and processed through a reception center in Virginia where unsmiling American soldiers had taken his photograph, recorded his name and rank, and issued him a uniform stenciled with the letters PW. He expected misery. He had been trained to expect misery. Wehrmacht indoctrination had been explicit. American prisoner camps would be brutal, primitive, a reflection of the mongrel nation that operated them. The Reich's propaganda ministry had distributed pamphlets describing American sadism, American starvation rations, American disregard for the Geneva Convention. Vogel had seen photographs, staged, he would later learn, of emaciated German prisoners in American custody. He had prepared himself for hunger, for abuse, for the degradation that awaited soldiers unfortunate enough to be captured by the enemy. The line moved forward. Vogel shuffled with it, his eyes on the ground. Then he reached the serving station. A black American soldier, a sight that itself defied everything Vogel had been taught about racial hierarchy, handed him a metal tray. On the tray sat a piece of fried chicken, golden and glistening. A mound of mashed potatoes, white and fluffy, with a pool of brown gravy. Green beans, cooked with some kind of pork. A bread roll, soft and pale, nothing like the dense black bread of German army rations. A square of yellow cake with chocolate frosting, and a bottle of Coca-Cola beaded with condensation in the Mississippi heat. Vogel did not move. The prisoners behind him began to murmur impatiently, but he could not move. He stood staring at the tray as if it contained a message in a language he could not read. "Problem, Fritz?" the American server asked, not unkindly. Vogel looked up. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. This is for prisoners?" The American shrugged. "This is Tuesday. You should see what we do for Sunday dinner." Vogel carried his tray to a table and sat down. Around him, other German prisoners were having similar reactions. Some eating ravenously, some staring in disbelief, a few weeping openly. A lieutenant from Vogel's transport group, a young officer named Brandt, who had commanded a panzer platoon in Africa, sat across from him with tears streaming down his face. "We have lost the war," Brandt said quietly, gesturing at his tray. "Look at this. Look at what they feed their prisoners. If they can give this to captured enemies, what did they give their own soldiers, their workers, their children?" He picked up the Coca-Cola, examined it as if it were an artifact from another civilization. "We are fighting a country that has so much it can waste food on men who tried to kill them. How can we defeat that? How can anyone defeat that?" Vogel had no answer. He bit into the fried chicken, the first fresh meat he had tasted in 4 months, and felt something crack inside him, not his body, something deeper, something that had to do with belief. What Heinrich Vogel experienced in that mess hall, what hundreds of thousands of German prisoners would experience in American camps over the next 2 years, was more devastating than any artillery barrage, more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. It was the complete and systematic destruction of the Nazi worldview through the simple, undeniable evidence of American abundance. They had been told America was weak. They had been told America was decadent. They had been told America would crumble against the disciplined might of the Reich. They had been told lies. And with every meal, every Coca-Cola, every impossible luxury that appeared before them in captivity, the lies died a little more. The German contempt for America was not merely propaganda. It was doctrine, woven into the fabric of Nazi ideology from the very beginning. Adolf Hitler had devoted an entire chapter of Mein Kampf to the racial degeneracy of the United States, a nation polluted by Jewish influence, weakened by racial mixing, softened by capitalism and jazz music, and the absence of military tradition. The America that Nazi ideologues described was a paper tiger, industrially powerful perhaps, but spiritually hollow, incapable of producing soldiers who could stand against the warriors of the master race. "The American is not a soldier," declared Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring in a 1940 radio address. "He is a businessman in uniform. He fights for profit, not for honor. When he faces hardship, when he faces the iron discipline of German arms, he will break. He will surrender. He will beg for the comforts his soft civilization has taught him to need. This assessment was reinforced by German intelligence reports that emphasized American materialism at the expense of martial virtue. Wehrmacht briefings described American soldiers as dependent on luxuries, on hot food, on regular mail, on recreation facilities that German troops had been trained to do without. The implication was clear. Americans could not endure the privations of real warfare. They would collapse when their supply lines failed, when their comforts disappeared, when they faced enemies who had been hardened by years of sacrifice. The German soldier requires only bread, ammunition, and faith in the Führer, wrote General Major Friedrich von Broich in a 1942 training memorandum. The American soldier requires ice cream, motion pictures, and letters from his mother. When these things are denied him, he ceases to function. This is the fundamental weakness of plutocratic armies. They fight for comfort, not conviction. They cannot match the spiritual strength of National Socialist warriors. The propaganda extended to descriptions of what German soldiers could expect if captured. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda produced films and pamphlets warning of American brutality, of starvation rations, of forced labor, of summary executions. German soldiers were told that surrender meant death or worse, that the Americans would treat them as the subhumans that Nazi ideology claimed non-Aryans to be. The Jew-controlled American government views German prisoners as slaves. Read a 1943 pamphlet distributed to troops in North Africa. You will be starved, beaten, and worked to death in their war factories. Your families will never learn your fate. Death in battle is preferable to the degradation that awaits you in American captivity. The lies served a purpose. They kept soldiers fighting when surrender might otherwise seem appealing. They maintained unit cohesion by making capitulation unthinkable. They reinforced the Nazi worldview by casting the enemy as monsters, cruel, uncivilized, inhuman. But the lies created a problem that Nazi leadership had not anticipated. They set expectations so low that any deviation would be devastating. A German soldier who expected starvation and received fried chicken did not simply feel relieved. He felt the foundations of his belief system crack. If the propaganda had lied about American prison camps, what else had it lied about? If Americans were not the brutal degenerates he had been promised, were they perhaps not the soft cowards he had been promised either? If the enemy could afford to feed prisoners better than the Wehrmacht fed its own combat troops, what did that say about the war's likely outcome? The Nazi regime had constructed an elaborate edifice of racial and ideological certainty. American prisoner of war camps would dismantle that edifice one meal at a time. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States would hold approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war in over 500 camps scattered across the American homeland. These men would work on farms, in factories, in logging operations. They would be paid for their labor, receive medical care, attend educational programs, and eat food that many of them had never tasted as free men in Germany. They would write letters home describing their experiences. Some of those letters would reach Germany, would circulate among families and friends, would spread whispered truths that contradicted everything the Reich's propaganda ministry proclaimed. And when the war ended, these men would return to a shattered nation carrying memories of American abundance that would shape German-American relations for generations. But all of that lay in the future. In the summer of 1943, the first large shipments of German prisoners were just arriving at camps across the American South and Midwest, stepping off trains into a world that made no sense, a world where enemy soldiers ate better than German civilians, where prison guards apologized for inconveniences, where the impossible was served 3 times a day with Coca-Cola on the side. The destruction of Nazi ideology was about to begin. It would be conducted not with bombs or bullets, but with fried chicken and ice cream, and the quiet, devastating evidence of a prosperity that German soldiers had been taught could not exist. The American prisoner of war system was designed by men who understood that the greatest weapon against an ideology is not violence, it is truth. In the spring of 1942, As the first German prisoners from North Africa began arriving at East Coast ports, the War Department faced a challenge without precedent in American history. The United States had held enemy prisoners before, roughly 4,000 Germans in World War I, but nothing on the scale that this war would demand. Military planners projected that the conflict would generate hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners, perhaps millions. They would need to be housed, fed, guarded, and processed for the duration of a war whose end no one could predict. The task fell to the Office of the Provost Marshal General, headed by Major General Allen W. Gullion, a career military lawyer with a reputation for meticulous administration. Gullion approached the prisoner problem with a philosophy that would shape the experience of every German soldier who fell into American hands. "We will treat prisoners of war as the Geneva Convention requires," Gullion told his staff in a May 1942 planning meeting, the minutes of which survive in National Archives files. "We will also treat them in a manner that reflects credit on the United States, not because they deserve it. Many of them are Nazis, and Nazis deserve nothing, but because we are Americans, and Americans do not become their enemies in order to defeat them." The Geneva Convention of 1929 established baseline requirements for prisoner treatment: adequate food, shelter, and medical care, protection from violence and intimidation, the right to send and receive mail, compensation for labor at rates equivalent to that paid to the detaining power's own soldiers. These requirements were the floor. Gullion intended to exceed them dramatically. "Every prisoner who passes through our system will return home, knowing two things," Gullion wrote in a directive that established policy for the entire POW program. First, that the United States is a nation of laws that keeps its promises, even to enemies. Second, that the United States possesses material abundance beyond anything German propaganda has described. Both truths will serve our interests. The first establishes moral authority. The second destroys the enemy's belief in victory. The system that emerged from Gullion's directives was designed around the daily routines of incarceration, and specifically around food. Prisoners would receive the same rations as American soldiers in rear area assignments, approximately 4,500 calories per day, compared to the 2,000-calorie rations that German troops in the field often subsisted on. Menus would include fresh meat, vegetables, bread, and desserts. Prisoners with dietary requirements, religious restrictions, medical needs would be accommodated. Coffee, tea, and soft drinks would be available. When possible, camps would produce some of their own food through gardens and livestock operations that prisoners would help maintain. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Gruber of the Provost Marshal's office, who supervised menu planning for the camp system, later described the reasoning in a post-war interview. "We calculated that the average German prisoner had been eating poorly for years. Ersatz coffee, black bread, limited meat, sugar substitutes. Many had been hungry since childhood. The German economy had been distorted by rearmament since 1933. When these men encountered American food in American quantities, the effect was psychological as much as physical. They were not just being fed. They were being shown what the war had denied them, what Hitler had denied them, what defeat would mean for Germany, and what victory had already given America." The camps themselves were constructed across the American South and Midwest, regions chosen for climate, available land, and distance from strategically sensitive areas. Former civilian conservation corps camps, abandoned fairgrounds, military training bases, any facility that could house several hundred to several thousand men was pressed into service. By 1945, there were 511 POW camps in the continental United States, plus hundreds of smaller branch camps attached to farms and factories where prisoners worked. The architectural philosophy was simple: functional security, not punitive austerity. Barracks were wooden, single-story structures with adequate heating and ventilation. Prisoners slept in bunks with mattresses and blankets. Latrines had running water and flush toilets, a technology that some prisoners from rural Germany had never encountered. Recreation areas included sports fields, gardens, and common rooms where prisoners could read, play cards, or listen to music. "The guards apologized to us," recalled Gefreiter Ernst Hauptmann, captured in Tunisia in 1943 and held at Camp Hearn in Texas. "On our first night, there was a problem with the hot water in the showers. An American sergeant came to our barracks and apologized. apologized to enemy prisoners for inconvenient hot water. I had not taken a hot shower in 8 months. I would have been grateful for cold water. And he apologized because the hot water was delayed by 30 minutes. I thought I was dreaming. I thought it must be a trick. It was not a trick. It was policy. Colonel Ralph Gruber, no relation to Arthur, commanded Camp Shelby, Mississippi, one of the largest POW facilities in the system. His orientation speech to new prisoners became legendary among the men who heard it. "You are prisoners of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention and according to American standards of decency. You will be fed, housed, and given medical care. You will be paid for your labor. You will be allowed to practice your religion, send letters to your families, and receive mail in return. If you have complaints, you will have the opportunity to register them with International Red Cross inspectors who visit this camp regularly. You may find this difficult to believe. You may have been told stories about American cruelty. I am not interested in what you were told. I am interested in what you will experience. In 6 months, you will know whether your leaders told you the truth about us. You will draw your own conclusions. The conclusions would be drawn. The letters would be written. The truth would spread. And the elaborate fortress of Nazi propaganda would begin to crumble. One shower, one meal, one impossible kindness at a time. The first months were defined by disbelief so profound it bordered on psychosis. Prisoners who had been indoctrinated for years in Nazi ideology could not process what they were experiencing. They invented explanations, elaborate theories that preserved their worldview against the assault of contradictory evidence. The food was poisoned, some whispered. The kindness was a trick to extract information. The Americans were fattening them for forced labor in uranium mines. The comfortable barracks were temporary staging areas before transport to death camps in Alaska. I refused to eat for 3 days, recalled Unteroffizier Wilhelm Brenner, captured at Kasserine Pass and held at Camp Concordia, Kansas. I was convinced the food contained drugs, truth serum perhaps, or some chemical that would weaken our will to resist. My comrades thought the same. We watched the guards eat from the same kitchen and told ourselves they had been given antidotes. The mind does extraordinary things to protect beliefs it cannot surrender. The resistance was not merely psychological. Within the camp populations, hardcore Nazis organized to enforce ideological discipline among their fellow prisoners. They formed secret tribunals that tried men accused of collaboration, defeatism, or insufficient loyalty to the Reich. They beat prisoners who expressed doubt about German victory. They murdered informants. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in November 1943, 5 German prisoners beat a fellow captive named Johannes Kunze to death with clubs and bottles. Kunze's crime: he had expressed the opinion that Germany would lose the war and had provided American interrogators with minor information about unit designations. His killers left his body in the recreation yard as a warning to others. "We are still German soldiers," declared Feldwebel Erich Gauss, one of the ringleaders, at his subsequent court-martial. "We are still bound by our oath to the Führer. Traitors deserve death, whether in Germany or in America. The Americans can feed us whatever they want. They cannot feed us surrender." The Tonkawa murder was not an isolated incident. American authorities documented over 40 serious assaults related to ideological enforcement in POW camps during 1943 to 1944. The Gestapo's long arm reached across the Atlantic through informal networks of true believers who maintained surveillance on their fellow prisoners, kept lists of those who wavered, and promised retribution when Germany won the war and the prisoners returned home. The threat was effective. Many prisoners who had begun to question Nazi ideology kept their doubts private, afraid that words spoken in an American camp would reach families in Germany. The regime had made clear that the relatives of traitors would suffer. A man who denounced Hitler in Kansas might return home to find his parents in a concentration camp, or might never return home at all if the Nazi faithful in the camp decided to administer their own justice. American camp administrators struggled to respond. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners the right to maintain military organization and discipline within their ranks, a provision designed to protect prisoners from abuse by their captors, now twisted into a mechanism for ideological terror. Separating hardliners from potential converts required intelligence that camp commanders often lacked. Intervening too aggressively risked creating martyrs. Intervening too passively allowed the Nazis to maintain control. "We had a fox in the henhouse problem," wrote Colonel James O'Brien, commander of Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, in a 1944 report to the Provost Marshal's office. The true believers were a minority, perhaps 10 to 15% of the prisoner population, but they controlled the majority through fear. A man who questioned the war publicly might be found beaten in his bunk the next morning, might be found dead. We couldn't protect everyone, and the prisoners knew it. The Nazis had created a miniature police state inside our camps, and we had given them the tools to do it by respecting their military organization. The problem was compounded by the propaganda that still reached prisoners through permitted channels. German-language newspapers, carefully censored to remove overt Nazi content, nonetheless carried news of German military operations that could be spun as evidence of impending victory. The V-2 rockets falling on London, the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. Each event fed the narrative that the Reich was not defeated, that the wonder weapons would turn the tide, that loyalty would be rewarded and treason punished. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Vogel, the same man who had wept over fried chicken at Camp Shelby, described the internal conflict that paralyzed many prisoners. "I knew what I was seeing. I knew the Americans had more than we had been told, more than Germany could match. Every day provided new evidence, the food, the equipment, the casual waste of resources that would have sustained a German company for a week. But knowing is not the same as believing. My mind accepted the evidence. My heart could not surrender the cause I had served since I was 16 years old. And there were men in the camp who watched for weakness, men who remembered names and wrote reports, men who said, 'What will you tell your family when you go home? What will you tell the Gestapo?' I was afraid. Afraid of the Americans? No. Afraid of my own comrades. Afraid of what would happen if I admitted what I already knew to be true." The struggle between evidence and ideology, between fear and reason, played out across hundreds of camps and hundreds of thousands of minds through 1943 and 1944. The American strategy of abundance created cognitive dissonance on an industrial scale, but cognitive dissonance by itself does not change beliefs. It creates discomfort, it raises questions, but it does not provide answers. The answers would come from a different source, from the prisoners themselves, from the slow accumulation of experiences that no ideology could explain away, from the moment when the gap between what they had been told and what they could see became too vast to bridge. That moment was coming. For some, it had already arrived. For most, it would arrive with a letter from home, a letter describing conditions in Germany that made American captivity look like paradise. July 14th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. Gefreiter Ernst Hauptmann sat on his bunk, reading the letter for the 4th time. His hands were shaking. The paper was thin, wartime paper, ration paper, and the handwriting was his mother's, the familiar loops and crosses that had followed him from childhood to Africa to this impossible place in the middle of Texas. The letter had taken 3 months to arrive. It described conditions in Stuttgart as of April 1944. Allied bombers had destroyed the neighborhood where Ernst had grown up. His family was living in a basement shelter, emerging only to stand in ration lines that sometimes lasted 6 hours. His younger sister had developed a cough that would not go away. Tuberculosis, probably, but there was no medicine to treat it and no doctors available to diagnose it. His father's factory had been requisitioned for war production. The workers received 1 meal per day, a thin soup with occasional vegetables. Meat had not been available for months. "We are proud of you," his mother had written. "We pray for victory. But Ernst, the nights are so long and the bombs do not stop. I do not write this to worry you. I write it because I do not know if I will have another chance to write. Whatever happens, know that we love you. Know that Germany remembers its soldiers." Ernst set the letter down and looked around his barracks. On the table beside his bunk sat the remains of his lunch, a ham sandwich he had not finished, an apple with 2 bites missing, a half-drunk bottle of Coca-Cola. The sandwich alone contained more meat than his family would see in a week. The apple, fresh fruit, in July, in the middle of a war, was a luxury his sister could not have imagined. The Coca-Cola was a fantasy, a product from a world that his mother's letter suggested no longer existed in Germany. He had thrown away food that morning. Breakfast had included eggs, bacon, toast, and orange juice. He had eaten the eggs and bacon, left the toast, poured out half the juice because he was not thirsty. The American guards had not remarked on the waste. Why would they? There would be more tomorrow. There was always more. Hauptmann. The voice came from the bunk across the aisle. Obergefreiter Friedrich Müller, a tank mechanic from the 21st Panzer Division, was watching him. Bad news from home? Ernst handed him the letter without speaking. Müller read it slowly. His face did not change expression, but Ernst watched his eyes stop moving at certain passages. The basement shelter, the ration lines, the sister's cough. When he finished, he handed the letter back and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "My mother wrote last month," Müller said quietly. "Hamburg. You remember the firestorm? She survived. My aunt and cousins did not. She is living in a refugee camp now. A German refugee camp." He laughed. A bitter, broken sound. "She wrote that she is grateful for 1 meal a day. 1 meal. I have eaten 3 meals today. I have eaten more today than she has eaten this week." He sat up and gestured around the barracks, at the bunks with their mattresses and clean sheets, at the electric lights humming overhead, at the fan that circulated air through the Texas heat. "Look at this place. Look at us. We are prisoners. We are the enemy, and we live better than our families. We live better than German soldiers still fighting at the front. We live better than anyone in Germany, except perhaps the Gauleiters and their whores." His voice cracked. "What kind of country loses a war so badly that its prisoners are the lucky ones? What kind of country are we fighting for?" The question hung in the air. Neither man could answer it. That evening, Ernst walked to the camp's recreation field, where a group of prisoners had gathered around a radio. American guards permitted access to approved broadcasts, news programs, music, sports, as part of the camp's policy of normalization. The prisoners had learned to read between the lines of what they heard, to extract military information from civilian reports, to piece together the progress of the war from fragments the censors had overlooked. The news that evening was from France. The Allied breakout from Normandy was complete. American forces were racing toward Paris. German armies were in retreat across a front that stretched from the Atlantic to the Vosges. Ernst listened, and for the first time, he did not translate the report into hope. He did not think, the Führer will counterattack. The wonder weapons will turn the tide. Victory is still possible. He thought instead of his mother in a basement shelter, of his sister's cough, of the ration lines that lasted 6 hours for a bowl of thin soup. He thought of the ham sandwich he had thrown away, and something inside him, something that had survived Tunisia and capture and the daily assault of American abundance, finally broke. "It's over," he said, quietly enough that only Müller could hear. "It's been over for a long time. We just didn't know it." Müller nodded. He did not argue. He did not report Ernst's defeatism to the camp's Nazi loyalists. He simply nodded, because he had read his own mother's letters, and he had reached the same conclusion in the silence of his own thoughts. They were not alone. Across hundreds of camps, in the summer of 1944, the letters from home arrived in waves, each one a small bomb detonating in the minds of men who had been trained to believe in German invincibility. The letters described cities in rubble. They described children without shoes, without school, without hope. They described a home front that was crumbling while the prisoners ate ice cream in the country of their enemies. The contrast was unbearable. It was designed to be unbearable. "We did not plan for the letters," Colonel Ralph Gruber admitted in a post-war interview. "We knew that contact with home would affect morale, but we expected it to cut both ways, to remind prisoners of what they were fighting for. We did not anticipate that conditions in Germany would deteriorate so rapidly, or that the comparison between prisoner life and civilian life would become so stark." By mid-1944, the letters were doing more to demoralize the prisoner population than anything we could have engineered. Their own families were telling them the truth we had been showing them all along. The Nazi enforcers in the camps tried to maintain discipline. They circulated rumors that the letters were forged by American intelligence. They threatened reprisals against anyone who spread defeatist sentiment. They reminded waverers that the Gestapo had long memories and that Germany would win in the end. But the letters kept coming, and the food kept appearing 3 times a day, in quantities that made the letters' descriptions of starvation unbearable to read. By autumn 1944, the tide had turned, not on distant battlefields, but in the minds of men who had finally seen through the lies that had sustained them. The believers were becoming a minority, the doubters were finding their voices, and the Nazi edifice, constructed so carefully over 12 years of propaganda, was collapsing in mess halls and mail rooms across the American heartland. The transformation accelerated through the final year of the war, driven by an accumulation of details so small and so relentless that resistance became impossible. It was not the grand gestures that broke them, it was the ordinary miracles, the things Americans took for granted that Germans had forgotten could exist. White bread. Lieutenant Karl Richter, captured during the Ardennes offensive in January 1945, later wrote a memoir that devoted 3 pages to his first encounter with American bread. In Germany, we had eaten Kriegsbrot, war bread, since 1939. It was dark, dense, heavy with sawdust and potato flour because wheat was reserved for the front. I had not tasted white bread since I was 14 years old. At the processing center in Le Havre, an American soldier handed me a sandwich. The bread was white, pure white, soft as a cloud. I held it in my hands and could not bring myself to eat it. I had forgotten that bread could look like this. I had forgotten that bread could smell like this. The soldier asked if something was wrong. I could not explain. How do you explain to a man who has never known hunger that he has just handed you a piece of your childhood? Cigarettes. American camps distributed cigarettes to prisoners as part of their standard ration. Camels, Lucky Strikes, Chesterfields, brands that German soldiers had heard of only as black market luxuries traded by rear echelon officers. Prisoners received a pack per day. Some smoked them, others hoarded them, unable to accept that more would come tomorrow. Still others used them as currency, trading with guards for items the camps did not provide. Magazines, candy, small tools for woodworking projects. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Brenner described watching a fellow prisoner burn through an entire pack in a single afternoon. He smoked one after another, lighting the next from the stub of the last. I asked him why he was wasting them. He laughed at me. "Wasting?" he said. "They give us another pack tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. I have smoked more cigarettes this week than I smoked in the last year in Russia. This is not waste. This is America." Medical care. German prisoners received treatment from American military doctors using American medical supplies. Sulfa drugs, penicillin, morphine, surgical equipment that the Wehrmacht's medical corps could only dream of. Men who would have died of infected wounds in German field hospitals recovered fully in American camp infirmaries. Men who would have lost limbs to gangrene kept their arms and legs because American surgeons had the time, the tools, and the medicine to save them. Sanitätsgefreiter Hans Weber, a German medic captured at Anzio, worked as an assistant in the camp hospital at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. His observations shattered what remained of his faith in German superiority. I had watched men die for lack of bandages. I had performed amputations with kitchen knives because surgical instruments were unavailable. I had held soldiers' hands while they died of infections that a single dose of penicillin could have cured. And here in a prison camp, I watched American doctors use penicillin to treat a German prisoner's minor infection. A minor infection, medicine that could have saved 100 German lives, used for a sore that would have healed on its own in a week. I asked the American doctor why. Why use precious medicine on an enemy prisoner's trivial wound? He looked at me as if I were speaking nonsense. "It's standard procedure," he said. "We treat infections before they become serious. Standard procedure for prisoners, for enemies." I went back to my barracks and wept because I understood then that we had lost the war years ago and no one had told us. Ice cream. The detail that appeared in memoir after memoir, letter after letter, interrogation after interrogation. Ice cream. The Americans served ice cream to prisoners of war. Not on special occasions, not as a reward for cooperation, as a regular part of the meal rotation, appearing in camp mess halls 2 or 3 times per week, scooped into bowls, and served to men who had tried to kill American soldiers weeks or months before. Hauptmann Erich Dönitz, no relation to the admiral, commanded a company of the 12th SS Panzer Division before his capture in Normandy. He was a true believer, a Hitler Youth graduate who had joined the Waffen-SS at 18 and never questioned the cause. He maintained his faith through processing, through transport, through his first weeks at Camp Polk, Louisiana, dismissing the food and comfort as American tricks. Then came the ice cream. It was a Sunday, Dönitz recounted in a 1962 interview. I remember the day because the mess hall served what the Americans called a Sunday dinner: roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, rolls, and for dessert, a bowl of vanilla ice cream with chocolate sauce. I sat across from a Feldwebel who had served in Stalingrad, a man who had eaten rats to survive the encirclement, a man who had watched his comrades freeze to death for lack of winter clothing. He stared at the ice cream for a long time, then he began to laugh. Not a happy laugh, a terrible laugh, the laugh of a man who has just understood a joke that has been played on him for years. "Ice cream," he said. "They feed their prisoners ice cream. We ate rats, and they feed their prisoners ice cream." He kept laughing. He laughed until he cried. The guards thought he had gone mad. Perhaps he had. Perhaps we all had. Because we had believed, truly believed, that we could defeat a country that had so much ice cream it could give it to enemy soldiers for Sunday dessert. The abundance became a weapon more devastating than any bomb. Prisoners who worked on American farms saw crops harvested and left to rot because there was more than the market could absorb. They saw livestock slaughtered and buried because storage facilities were full. They saw farmhouses with electric lights, running water, automobiles in the driveway, radios playing music, not the homes of wealthy landowners, but ordinary farmhouses owned by ordinary families who lived better than German generals. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Brenner worked a harvest detail at a farm outside Concordia, Kansas, in September 1944. The experience left him unable to maintain even the pretense of belief. The farmer's wife brought us lunch in the field: sandwiches, apples, lemonade, and a pie she had baked that morning. Apple pie, still warm, for prisoners, for Germans who had killed American boys in Africa. I asked the guard why she would feed us like this. He said, "Man believes in Christian charity." Christian charity, a phrase I had heard all my life, but never seen practiced on enemies. I ate that pie and understood that the Nazi Party had lied to us about everything, about America, about the war, about the world. A country whose farm wives baked pies for enemy prisoners was not a country that could be defeated by ideology. It was a country that had already won and was simply waiting for us to realize it. I think I realized it with that pie. I think a lot of us did. The small kindnesses were worse than cruelty would have been. Cruelty we could have hated. Kindness left us nothing to hold on to. By early 1945, the transformation was nearly complete. Camp surveys conducted by the Provost Marshal's office estimated that active Nazi loyalists had declined from roughly 30% of the prisoner population in mid-1943 to less than 10% by the war's end. The enforcers still existed, still threatened, still occasionally attacked suspected collaborators, but they had lost the silent majority that had once enabled their control. The doubters had become the mainstream. The questions had become conclusions. And in barracks across America, German prisoners were writing letters home that would have earned them execution a year earlier. Letters describing American abundance, American kindness, American power that could not be matched and should not be opposed. The propaganda ministry in Berlin intercepted some of these letters. They were horrified by what they read, but there was nothing they could do. The truth had escaped, and no censor could recapture it. The prisoners had seen, the prisoners knew, and when they finally went home, they would carry that knowledge with them. A virus of truth that would infect a generation. The statistics tell a story of ideological collapse measured in meals served and minds changed. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States held 425,871 German prisoners of war. They consumed approximately 900 million meals prepared in American camp kitchens, an average of over 2,100 meals per prisoner over the course of captivity. The War Department spent an estimated $230 million on prisoner food alone. a figure that would exceed $3.5 billion in modern currency. Each prisoner cost approximately $1.50 per day to feed, more than twice what the Wehrmacht allocated for frontline combat troops. The camps employed over 50,000 American personnel as guards, administrators, medical staff, and support workers. They operated 511 main camps and over 700 branch facilities spread across 46 states. The infrastructure built to house German prisoners exceeded the scope of many American cities' public facilities, a parallel nation of barracks, mess halls, hospitals, and recreation centers devoted to caring for men who had sworn to destroy American democracy. The prisoners worked as Geneva Convention provisions allowed. They harvested crops across the agricultural heartland, an estimated 800 million man-hours of labor that helped feed both American civilians and the armies fighting overseas. They logged timber in the Pacific Northwest, processed cotton in the Deep South, canned vegetables in the Midwest. They earned wages, 80 cents per day in canteen scrip, that they could spend on luxuries beyond their basic rations: candy, tobacco, toiletries, books. Some camps operated orchestras, others published newspapers. Several organized soccer leagues that drew crowds of American spectators who had never seen the European game played at high levels. A camp in Arizona built a replica of a Bavarian village, complete with painted murals and carved wooden signs, as a recreation project. A camp in Georgia staged theatrical productions that local American critics reviewed favorably in regional newspapers. The contrast with conditions in German POW camps was absolute and damning. American prisoners held by Germany survived on rations that averaged 1,500 calories per day, less than half the American allotment. They lived in unheated barracks through brutal winters. They received medical care that ranged from inadequate to non-existent. Approximately 1% of American POWs in German custody died in captivity. The death rate for Germans in American custody was less than 0.1%. But the true measure of the American POW program's success lay not in statistics, but in testimony, in the words of men who had entered the camps as enemies and emerged as something else entirely. Major General Gerhard Engel, who had served as Hitler's army adjutant before commanding a division on the Eastern Front, was captured in April 1945 and held at Camp Clinton, Mississippi. His post-war memoirs included an extended reflection on his time in American captivity. "I entered the camp as a National Socialist, convinced that Germany's defeat was temporary, that the Reich would rise again, that the Führer's vision would ultimately prevail. I left the camp 18 months later as a man who understood that everything I had believed was a lie. It was not the lectures or the re-education programs that changed me, though those existed, and I attended them out of boredom if nothing else. It was the daily evidence of American society that I witnessed through the fence and experienced within the camp: the abundance, the waste, the casual generosity toward enemies. I remember watching an American guard throw away half a sandwich because he was not hungry. I had commanded men who died for lack of food. I had signed orders sending soldiers into battle with 3 days' rations for a 2-week operation. And this guard, this private, this nobody, could discard food because he simply did not want it. In that moment, I understood that we had never had a chance. Not because American soldiers were braver or better led, because America could afford to waste what Germany could not afford to have. No ideology can defeat that. No will can overcome it. We were fighting a war of scarcity against a nation of abundance. We were doomed before we began." Oberst Wilhelm Meyer Datring, an intelligence officer who had served on Rommel's staff in North Africa, provided testimony to American historians in 1947 that captured the psychological dimensions of the POW experience. The food was a weapon. The Americans understood this, I think, even if they did not articulate it in such terms. Every meal was an argument. Every Coca-Cola was a piece of evidence. Every ice cream sundae was a refutation of everything Goebbels had told us about American weakness and German destiny. I watched hard men, men who had fought in Russia, who had endured Stalingrad, who had seen things that would break most human beings. I watched these men weep over chocolate cake, not because they were hungry, because they understood what the chocolate cake meant. It meant that the war was lost. It meant that Germany was finished. It meant that everything we had sacrificed, our youth, our comrades, our souls, had been sacrificed for nothing. The Americans did not need to torture us, or starve us, or beat us. They simply fed us, and the feeding destroyed us more completely than any cruelty could have. Gefreiter Ernst Hauptmann, the prisoner who had wept over letters from home at Camp Herne, returned to Germany in 1946 and spent the rest of his life as a schoolteacher in the rebuilt city of Stuttgart. In 1985, he participated in an oral history project documenting the experiences of German POWs. His testimony, recorded 40 years after his release, retained the wonder and confusion of his original experience. I have been asked many times what I remember most about my time in America. People expect me to talk about the guards, or the work details, or the journey home, but what I remember most is a glass of orange juice. It was my first morning at Camp Herne. I went through the breakfast line, and the server poured me a glass of orange juice. Fresh orange juice. I had not tasted an orange since 1939. I did not know that oranges still existed outside of memory. I drank that juice standing in the mess hall, unable to move. I thought about my sister, who was coughing in a basement shelter in Stuttgart. I thought about my mother, who stood in line for 6 hours to receive a cabbage. I thought about the Germany I had left, and the America I had found, and I understood that these two countries existed in different universes. One had oranges, one did not. Everything else, the politics, the ideology, the war, was just explanation for that simple fact. I never believed in National Socialism again. I could not. The orange juice had made belief impossible. The repatriation began in 1945 and continued through 1946 as ships carried hundreds of thousands of former prisoners back to a Germany that no longer existed. They returned to rubble, to occupation zones, to families shattered by bombing and starvation. They returned carrying memories of American abundance that seemed increasingly unreal as they confronted the devastation of their homeland. But the memories did not fade, they spread. Returned POWs told their stories to families, to friends, to anyone who would listen. They described the food, the medicine, the kindness of guards who apologized for broken air conditioning. They became vectors of truth in a society that had been fed lies for 12 years. They provided living testimony that contradicted everything the Nazi regime had promised about American weakness and German superiority. A 1948 survey conducted by American occupation authorities found that former POWs held dramatically more favorable views of the United States than Germans who had not experienced American captivity. They were more likely to support democratic institutions, more likely to reject authoritarian politics, more likely to believe that cooperation with the West offered Germany's best path forward. The ice cream and Coca-Cola had done what armies could not. They had changed minds. The American POW program was never designed as a psychological operation. It was designed to comply with international law, to reflect American values, and to solve the practical problem of housing hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. The ideological transformation it produced was a byproduct, an unintended consequence of treating enemies with decency in a conflict defined by industrialized murder. But the consequence was real. The transformation was real, and the men who experienced it carried the evidence home in their memories, their letters, and their unshakable knowledge that everything they had been taught about America was wrong. They had seen the enemy, they had eaten his food, they had experienced his abundance, and they had learned in the most visceral way possible that the enemy was not what they had been promised. September 1946, Stuttgart, Germany. Heinrich Vogel stepped off the train into a city he did not recognize. The Stuttgart of his memory, the Stuttgart of his childhood, of beer halls and Christmas markets, and the great Königstrasse lined with shops, no longer existed. In its place stood ruins, mountains of rubble where buildings had been, hollow shells of structures that had somehow survived the firestorms, their windows empty, their walls scorched black. People moved through the wreckage like ghosts, thin and gray, picking through debris for anything of value. He had been warned. The other prisoners on the transport ship had talked about what awaited them. Letters from home had described the destruction, and American newsreels shown in the camps had documented the bombing campaigns that had reduced German cities to ash. But knowing was not the same as seeing. Knowing was not the same as standing in the place where your father's bakery had been and finding nothing but a crater filled with stagnant water. Vogel walked through the city for hours, searching for landmarks that no longer existed. He found the street where he had grown up. The apartment building was gone. The church where he had been baptized was a roofless shell. The school where he had learned to read, to calculate, to believe in the greatness of Germany. Rubble, all of it, indistinguishable from the rubble of 1,000 other buildings destroyed by 1,000 other bombs. He sat down on a broken wall and tried to reconcile two realities that could not coexist in the same mind. 3 months ago, he had been eating fried chicken in Mississippi. He had been drinking Coca-Cola in the shade of a whitewashed barracks, while American guards complained about the heat. He had been throwing away food his mother would have killed for, food his neighbors had died without, because he was not hungry and there would be more tomorrow. Now he sat in the ashes of his childhood, watching a woman pick through garbage for potato peels. The distance between those two worlds was not measured in miles. It was measured in something larger, in the gap between what Germany had become and what America had always been, between the lies he had been taught and the truth he had learned, between the nation that had sent him to war and the nation that had fed him in defeat. He thought about that first meal at Camp Shelby, the fried chicken, the mashed potatoes, the Coca-Cola sweating in the Mississippi heat. He thought about Lieutenant Brandt weeping over his tray, saying, "We have lost the war before the war was even half finished." Brandt had been right. They had lost the war long before Vogel sat down to that meal. Lost it in the factories they could not build, the resources they could not extract, the abundance they could not match. The meal had simply made the loss visible. He thought about all the meals that followed, the Sunday dinners with roast beef and ice cream, the white bread that tasted like childhood, the orange juice that proved Germany and America existed in different universes. Each meal had been a lesson, though he had not understood the curriculum at the time. Each meal had taught him that the Reich's promises were fantasies, that German superiority was propaganda, that the war had been unwinnable from the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor and America decided to fight. He had eaten the evidence of German defeat 3 times a day for 3 years. He had grown fat on the proof of Nazi lies. And now he sat in the ruins those lies had created, watching his countrymen starve. A child approached him, a girl, perhaps 8 years old, her dress torn, her face smudged with dirt. She held out her hand without speaking. The gesture was universal. "Give me something. Anything. I am hungry." Vogel reached into his pocket. The Americans had given each returning prisoner a small package of supplies for the journey home. Crackers, chocolate, a tin of meat. He had saved the chocolate, some instinct telling him he might need it. He placed it in the girl's hand. She stared at it. "Hershey's," the wrapper said. "American chocolate, manufactured in Pennsylvania, shipped across an ocean to feed a German prisoner, carried home in his pocket, now given to a German child who had perhaps never tasted chocolate in her life." The girl did not thank him. She simply turned and ran, clutching the chocolate like a treasure beyond price. Vogel watched her go and felt the last remnants of his old beliefs crumble into dust. He had been a Nazi. He had believed in the Führer, in German destiny, in the 1,000-year Reich that would dominate the world. He had marched and fought and killed for that belief. He had been willing to die for it. And then he had been captured, and the Americans had fed him ice cream, and everything he believed had melted like ice cream in the summer sun. The prison camps had not tortured the Nazism out of him. They had not lectured it out, or beaten it out, or starved it out. They had simply shown him another world. A world of abundance so vast that enemies could be fed like guests, where guards apologized for minor inconveniences, where a nation at war could spare chocolate and Coca-Cola for soldiers who had tried to destroy it. That world was incompatible with Nazi ideology. It could not exist if Nazi ideology were true. And because that world did exist, because Vogel had lived in it, eaten its food, experienced its impossible generosity, Nazi ideology could not be true. The logic was inescapable. The conclusion was devastating. He had been lied to. They had all been lied to. And the proof of the lie was not in arguments or evidence or testimony. The proof was in the taste of fried chicken on a summer afternoon in Mississippi. The proof was in a glass of orange juice at dawn. The proof was in the Hershey bar he had just placed in a hungry child's hand. The Americans had won the war with tanks and planes and bombs, but they had won something larger, something more lasting, with mess halls and canteens and the simple, revolutionary act of treating enemies like human beings. Over 400,000 German prisoners passed through American camps. They returned to Germany carrying stories that could not be suppressed, memories that could not be erased, truths that could not be unlearned. They became the foundation of a new Germany, a Germany that rejected the lies of the past because the men who had believed those lies had eaten the evidence of their falseness. The Nazi regime had promised German soldiers that America was weak, decadent, incapable of matching the will and discipline of the master race. The American prison camps had answered with fried chicken and Coca-Cola and ice cream on Sunday afternoons. History records which argument proved more convincing. Heinrich Vogel lived until 1987. He became a postal worker, married a woman he met in a refugee assistance office, raised 3 children in the rebuilt city of Stuttgart. He never joined a political party. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, but his children remembered that he kept a single American artifact until the end of his life. An empty Coca-Cola bottle, washed and preserved, sitting on a shelf in his study. When they asked him why he kept it, he would hold the bottle up to the light and say nothing for a long moment. "Because it taught me the truth," he would finally answer. "Because it taught me that everything I believed was wrong. Because a country that could give this to its enemies was not a country that could be defeated by hatred." He would set the bottle back on the shelf and look at it the way a man looks at a holy relic. "We thought we were the master race," he would say. "They gave us Coca-Cola and ice cream, and we understood that we were fools." The bottle remained on the shelf until the day he died. His children kept it there afterward. They understood, without fully understanding, that it was more than a souvenir. It was a monument to the moment when lies died and truth began. It was proof that abundance could defeat ideology. It was America, in a bottle, teaching Germany what it meant to lose, and, in losing, to finally see clearly. The prisoners had laughed when they were captured, certain that American softness would be their salvation. They stopped laughing when they realized that American softness was the hardest thing they had ever faced. It fed them, it clothed them, it showed them a world their leaders had promised could not exist. And in showing them that world, it destroyed the one they had been fighting for, one meal at a time, one Coca-Cola at a time, one impossible kindness at a time, until nothing was left but the truth.